Hello, I'm your host, Michael Buckner Sr. Welcome to the Narrow Gate program. Today's program is very special. It talks about, and this is a story that speaks about my Christian conversion. Today's program is titled, Live in Such a Way That Those Who Know You But Don't Know God Will Come to Know God Because They Know You. Growing up in New London, Connecticut during the mid-60s and 70s and 80s was more than a challenge. It was hell for me as a young teenager. Drug use within this little quiet New England town was rampant. During the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan implemented federal legislation to combat the growing epidemic of drug distribution throughout the nation. This drug epidemic was massive within Black and Hispanic communities across the country. The First Lady, Nancy Reagan, began a national drug campaign to curb the rising tide of teen drug usage throughout the nation. The First Lady's drug campaign was titled, Just Say No to Drugs. Now, in contrast to the drug campaign, Black and Hispanic males between the ages of 16 to 20 were imprisoned and given long sentences for small amounts of marijuana and cocaine. During those years, two of my best friends were Marvin Hearn and Nicky Baldwin. We would often get together and hang out and smoke marijuana. My friendship with these guys grew over the years. Now, when I first met Marvin, my life changed in a very significant way. Strangely, each of us had one thing in common. Both of us came from single-parent homes. Although in my case, my mother was married, but my stepfather, Charles, wasn't much of a father figure. Nikki's mother, on the other hand, had a total of 5 children: Angela, Aaron, Wesley, Dwight, and Nikki. Within our neighborhood, drugs like marijuana and cocaine were readily available to anyone who could afford to purchase them. Ironically, all the dealers selling drugs in the neighborhood lived there. When I was growing up in New London, I was angry most of the time. My anger was pure and raw. The root of my anger stemmed from the fact that I never got to meet my biological father. Like my two best friends, neither of us lived in homes where our biological fathers were present. Looking back during this time, the happiest times in my life was when I met a girl named Cynthia Young. She was tall and slender and had long black hair that extended down her back. She was really my first girlfriend. I was totally head over heels about her. Although her father didn't think I was the right person to be involved with his daughter. He particularly didn't like the fact that she would often sneak out of the house to meet with me. Reflecting back on those years, I would have to agree with his assessment of me. My priorities weren't in the right order as it relates to life. Now that I have daughters, I clearly understand Mr. Young's reaction to someone like myself during those years of my life. I was undisciplined and spent too much time hanging out on the street. It's crazy, but I still have feelings for his daughter, although it's probably just wishful thinking on my part. You know, to believe that there's any chance that I could reestablish a relationship with her, because it has been years since I have seen her. When I entered New London High School, there I met Marvin and Nikki. Strangely, when I was in elementary school, I excelled academically. Although once I entered high school, the curriculum there was very challenging for me. A couple of months after entering 9th grade, I decided to drop out of high school due to my inability to excel academically. I shared my decision with my mother. The following day, we reported to the principal's office. Once there, I proudly announced my decision to drop out of high school. But I remained in school for several more months. Halfway through the first semester, I dropped out of high school. As a result of that decision, I learned 2 valuable lessons. First, I discovered that if I was going to be successful in life, having a formal education was mandatory. 2, being a black male and uneducated, career opportunities were very limited. My two best friends, Marvin and Nikki, successfully graduated from high school. Several years later, both Marvin and Nikki died. Marvin's death was caused by his heavy usage of heroin. Marvin was found dead from a heroin overdose. His mother died several months after his death. To this day, I truly believe that she died from a broken heart. Nikki's death came several years later from heroin usage and being infected with the HIV virus. About a year prior to Nikki's death, I stopped by his house. By the time I arrived at his house, it was evening. Once there, Nikki suggested that we walk across town. I remember that particular night. It was cloudy and dark outside. The building where he led me to was located in the predominantly white section of town. Now, as we approached the neighborhood, all the homes had their outside lights turned on. Up the block from the entrance to the neighborhood was a large park. As we got closer to the building, I noticed that none of the street lights surrounding the park were turned on. As we made our way up the front steps of the building, it was too dark to really determine what the building was. Each of us sat down and rolled the joint. After about 30 minutes of smoking weed and talking about our activities of the day, we decided to leave and head back home. I asked him, I said, "Man, how did you find this place?" He replied, "Man, I found this place a couple of months ago." By the time we had finished smoking a couple more joints, I felt like I was literally floating on air. As I got up to leave, I suddenly heard a quiet voice within my head saying, "Turn around and look up at the front of the building." As I got up and turned around to look up at the front of the building with bloodshot eyes, at that very moment, one of the street lights in front of the park suddenly turned on. It was shining straight at the upper portion of the building. As I looked up, I discovered that the building was a church with a cross affixed to the front of the building. At that moment, I felt so low and ashamed. And I said, "Man, why didn't you tell me this place was a church?" Nikki just laughed and said, "Man, it's okay, what's the big deal?" I felt so ashamed. I stared at the cross intensely, and it felt like my heart sank within me. Neither of us said a word to each other at that moment. We just headed down the steps and started walking back toward our side of town. That wonderful high I had as a result of smoking weed was suddenly gone. I didn't say a word to Nikki as we walked back toward our neighborhood. As we reached our side of town, I headed toward my house around the corner. Nikki headed up the street toward his house. Deep down inside, I knew the events of that night were morally wrong, and I felt like God had just pointed his finger at both of us as a warning. I couldn't rid myself of that terrible feeling. Now, the Catholic priest Martin Luther, born in 1483, wrote, "Your God is that to which your heart clings and entrusts itself." Realizing the sinful act I committed earlier, it was like a bolt of lightning struck me right through the heart. In the book of Psalm, chapter 51, verses 10 to 13, describes my mental and physical condition at that moment. It reads, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with your generous spirit." Now that I'm older, and as a Christian, I have come to realize there are 4 fundamental things associated with following Jesus Christ. First, if we allow our minds to be unprincipled and uncontrolled, we run the risk of being unprepared for the attacks of sin and Satan. Next, we should never allow anyone or anything to derail our spiritual walk because it will cause a breach in our relationship with God. And we should never flirt with sin or try to prove we can handle it. And lastly, if something is a temptation to you, then avoid it like the plague. During earlier years in my life, when I was in my late 20s, I truly believed that the only goal in life was to accumulate lots of money and have multiple women and drive an expensive car, which supposedly was to have meant life was good. Years later, I have come to realize as a Christian, all those things I chased after brought no real satisfaction. Now there's an old saying, with age comes wisdom. However, millions of people have not learned this lesson. Over the course of my lifetime, I have met hundreds of black men who viewed themselves wrongly as being pimps or hustlers. Many of these men were highly intelligent individuals who could have pursued a profession and a professional career in any area of industry: doctors, judges, college professors, teachers, lawyers, scientists, engineers, district attorneys, and policemen. They served themselves rather than serving God. Ironically, all these men have never come to realize the lesson found in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24. It reads, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Now, in closing, if you're the type of person who has the follow the crowd mentality and follow the current modern day cultural trend, which is if it feels good, do it, guess what? There are two spiritual verses I would like to share with you that is found in the Holy Bible. First, the answer to how a person should live is found in the book of Matthew, chapter 16, verse 27. It reads, "For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works." Second, each person living today will have two dates posted on their gravestone: a birth date and a death date. In the book of Psalm, chapter 22, verse 29a, it reads, "All those who go down to the dust shall bow before him, even he who cannot keep himself alive." Thank you for joining us here at the Narrow Gate. Join us next time here in the Narrow Gate. Thank you.